So this lecture is going to be about prevention and promotion, and specifically implementing programs. So as you remember from the last lecture, we talked about prevention and promotion. We were talking about key concepts of prevention and promotion, and what prevention and promotion is sort of on the individual level, right? So this lecture is going to be dedicated to understanding what a prevention and promotion program is, and what it looks like, and how it's implemented. And so there are a couple of models of implementation for prevention and promotion, and so we're going to take a look at those, and we're going to look at some of the factors that affect that, and we're going to take some steps toward actually implementing a program, right? So what that would look like in terms of actually implementing a prevention and promotion program. So when we think about prevention programs, we all have been part of prevention programs in some form or another, right? You're kind of in a prevention program just being at the university. So prevention programs can be thought of as very general, right? Things that affect the entire community, the entire society. So think back to the previous lecture of primary prevention, right? So people who have been involved in something like DARE or have watched something like Sesame Street has been part of a prevention program. Sesame Street was actually created as a preventative measure, right? To enhance the readiness of children, of specifically low-income children, to enter elementary school or enter kindergarten. So prevention programs they're interventions aimed at preventing or alleviating some certain social problem, right? So HIV/AIDS, enhancing education. So we should also put in here enhancement of certain capacities, right? Not just preventing problems, but also enhancing certain capacities, acting as that promoter. And many of your sites are dedicated to prevention in some form, right? You know, the HIV/AIDS Alliance, for example, is dedicated to trying to prevent malnutrition among some of their clients, right? Among people with HIV and AIDS. In addition, prevention programs are often very, very difficult to implement, and this is most because the real-world conditions under which we try to implement various prevention programs don't match the trial conditions, right? So when we create a prevention program, we develop it under optimal conditions, and these optimal conditions sort of weed out any extraneous factors that could influence the program. And so when we put the program into a real-world scenario, oftentimes these extraneous factors are reintroduced, and they affect the program, and that makes them really difficult to implement. And so we'll talk about some of that throughout this talk. Before we get into implementation of programs, let's talk about the evolution of program dissemination. And so what dissemination is it's the way in which a program is sort of put out into the public for other people to use, right? Disseminated is sort of the key word there. And so this sort of started back in the 70s, and the first approach that was used was called the Cookbook Approach. And what this was is programs would be developed under these certain optimal conditions, right? And there were these kits that were supposed to give sort of step-by-step replication into a community setting. And so if you were, say you were the director of the HIV/AIDS Alliance, and you wanted to do, AIDS wasn't back in the 70s, but just imagine, right? And you wanted to implement a prevention program for preventing malnutrition. And so you do this cookbook approach where you would get this sort of pre-cooked up program, and you would try to implement it in your own site. And that had its own issues, right? Because you didn't take the context into particular sites into consideration. Then there were replication of programs, and so what this would do is people who developed programs, intervention programs, would actually come into sites and train staff in particular settings to adapt the program to that particular setting, right? And then adaptation of programs, even later on, that understood that programs needed to be adapted specifically to settings, right? So you would have the program developer sort of as a consultant throughout the entire process of implementing a program. And that program would be able to be even more adapted to the site itself and to the context of the situation. And now moving forward, we sort of have this intervention/innovation component. And the idea here is that not only do we need to adapt programs for particular sites, we need to also innovate and create various procedures and various ideas for the program that may not be replicatable across various sites. So doing stuff that's sort of tailored to your own program or your own context, but at the same time innovating the program and trying new things with the program to see if they work better with your particular site. So when we're thinking about trying to implement a program, there are a lot of things that become issues when trying to implement these programs. And so this is sort of the list at this point of things that are issues with creating a new program or implementing a new program. And I'll just go over these quickly. I'll leave this up to you to understand these deeper from your book. But fidelity is the extent to which the context or the setting implements the program as the program states, right? So basically follows the rules of the cookbook, the extent to which somebody follows those rules, right? So let's think of a simple example like baking cookies. Fidelity is the extent to which you follow the rules on the box of cookies if you're using a pre-made batch. Dosage and intensity, that goes along with fidelity a little bit. Dosage and intensity is the extent to which some people of your context are exposed to the intervention, right? The extent to which you're touching people with the intervention. So think about it sort of in clinical terms, right? The dosage of your medication, the extent to which you take your medication as it's supposed to be taken. The quality of the program is sort of self-explanatory. Participant responsiveness is, also sort of self-explanatory, the extent to which participants are responding positively to the program. Program differentiation, that's the extent to which programs sort of vary from context to context. Monitoring of control conditions, these are sort of trying to identify if any extraneous factors are coming into play when you're implementing your program. Program reach is the extent to which programs reach in the community that they're trying to reach. And again, adaptation, the extent to which programs have adapted or sites have adapted programs to fit their particular context. So again, I'll allow you to sort of read more in depth with this. But these are things that you should know. So now let's talk about the stages of implementation, or the stages of sort of creating a program, creating an intervention program. And so it says scaling up here because at each various step, the program sort of gets scaled up. It gets a little bit larger. So experimental development is, as I mentioned earlier, creating a program under ideal conditions. And understanding if we do A, then B will happen, right? So it's understanding that cause and effect. And so in that stage, we identify if certain factors influence other factors, right? So we can think of this sort of in clinical terms, is sort of the easiest way to think about it. So when you think in clinical terms, if we put somebody in an experimental condition and we give them a medication, for example, and we find that that medication works and it's actually doing what it's supposed to be doing, it's effective, then what we can do is we can move that forward and do some technological application. So we can apply that into real-world settings that are slightly smaller, slightly larger, and see if the extraneous factors that come into play there influence that relationship. And so that's what the technological application is. It's applying it in a real-world setting, but not to large scale. And then the diffusion of innovation is is taking that intervention, that innovation, and diffusing that to the larger public, so that various sites around the country can use that innovation and diffuse it within their own contexts. And so this is the place where things can get really mucky, and this is where that sort of implementation issues really come into play. And then we have widespread implementation, which is where everybody sort of has access to the program. So there are sort of three models here. Here's three models of implementation. One model is sort of the research to practice model. So it's where researchers come up with an idea, go through the various steps, and say, hey, we have something cool here that works. Let's diffuse this out into the community. Let's give this widespread recognition. And then there are sort of, and we would sort of think of that as a top-down approach, right? An approach where researchers or policymakers or somebody like that is creating a program and telling other people, telling the community, like, this works, you should use this. Community-centered models, on the other hand, are sort of the bottom-up type of models. They ask, what are the issues that are facing our communities, and what programs are effective in dealing with this? And so they work from the community center, and they reach out to researchers and to policymakers to identify various programs that may be effective. So this is more of a bottom-up approach. And then there's the integrative model. So the integrative model is sort of going both ways, right? It's using both the top-down and the bottom-up approach, and it's a collaborative approach between researchers or program creators and the community in which they work. And so there's sort of three main areas here. Prevention, synthesis, and translation is the program specialists or the program creators creating the rules around the innovation and the rules around the program to create a sustainable program within a community. Prevention support system is the extent to which prevention specialists or program creators provide support to community members and to communities in implementing their particular program. And then the delivery system is the systems that are actually involved in implementing the program, right? So these things, these three pieces here are very important in creating a model and diffusing a model out into the community to make it effective. Here are some factors that affect the implementation process, or more specifically, the diffusion process, the process of diffusing an innovation into the community. I'm not going to go into each one of these. They go across levels of analysis. Just know that these are important things to know. So now let's talk about steps towards implementation. Now this is the last piece of our talk here. So we've talked about issues of implementation, we've talked about models of implementation. Now let's talk about the steps needed to actually implement an innovation in a community. So first we have problem identification and definition. So this is an important one. This is where you get the entire community on board with what an issue is. So a problem must be widely identified as a problem in order to be really understood as a problem, and it also must be identified as being able to be prevented, right? So poverty is one of those that is a problem that has a lot of issues, because while many people understand that it is a social problem and it is identified as a social problem, a lot of people think that it can't be prevented. We're sort of in this place where we will always have people in poverty, right? So because of that thinking, it's not possible to really implement a strong prevention program. So you need to have those two components to really start implementing strong programs. And we've done a lot of work around HIV/AIDS on this particular issue. Now, the second step here is really assessing the community setting or the capacity of the community. And what that means is the ability, the skills, the resources, the social context that allows a program to be implemented. So these are the resources and capacities that organizations have, that communities have, and that individuals within those communities have to bring about social change. Then you have to review available programs. So if you want to implement a program, you have to review what's available. And two key definitions here to look for under reviewing types of programs is efficacy and effectiveness. And so the efficacy is the benefits under optimal conditions. So this is sort of the first experimental piece that we talked about earlier. Effectiveness, on the other hand, are the real-world results under real-world conditions, right? So a program can have efficacy but not really be effective, right? So going through those stages of adaptation, innovation, so on and so forth, can influence the effectiveness of a program. Next, we need to assess the fit between the program and setting. And so the idea here is that the culture, the rules, the norms of the setting fits the program, right? So if we're bringing in a program that violates social norms or cultural norms, that's a big issue, and it's an issue because people will not, people who you're trying to implement a prevention program on, will not accept it if it doesn't adhere to their cultural norms, if it doesn't adhere to their cultural identification. And so we must really understand that, and at multiple levels of analysis, not just in the community, but in organizations, in localities, and microsystems, we need to know that these values fit, that the values of the program are similar to the values of the context. In addition, training and support for staff is absolutely essential. And so if I'm a program creator and I want my program to be adapted and to be implemented in communities, I need to provide technical assistance and training to the organizations and to the localities that are going to implement that program. It sort of makes sense, right? If you're going to adopt something, you want to make sure that somebody is there to help you out throughout the process and make sure that you're implementing it with fidelity, that you're using the correct dosage, and that it's being adapted in a way that makes sense for that context. And one of the final steps here is evaluating, right? And we'll go into evaluation in Chapter 13, so in about a week and a half, 2 weeks, I think. And evaluation is really important because what evaluation does is it evaluates the program, and it evaluates whether or not that program is working in your context. And so this evaluation process is really important because it'll let us know if the program we're using is being effective, right? If it has effectiveness within our particular context. And if not, we can innovate, we can change things to ensure the program works, or we can adopt another program. And as part of evaluation, one thing that we need to be aware of is this is pronounced iatrogenic effects. And what iatrogenic effects are effects that are sort of unintended consequences. So these are harmful consequences of a program when we thought a program would work. So this is one of those situations where a program may have efficacy, but when we bring it into the community, it is not effective. It doesn't have effectiveness. And the Scared Straight program is a perfect example of this. The Scared Straight program, for those of you that are unaware, basically put juvenile offenders into prison systems and into jail systems for a day, and there's a TV show about it, and these prisoners and guards yell at the children and scream at them and curse at them and talk about rape and murder and so on and so forth, right? And they thought this would be effective. They thought, well, if we do this, we'll scare the crap out of them, and hopefully they won't find themselves back here. But what they actually found is that it reinforced attitudes and behavior associated with criminality, and juvenile offenders who went that route actually were more likely to offend and find themselves in those situations later. So that's an issue. That's an example of an iatrogenic effect. So when we create a program or when we adopt a program in a community, we want to ensure that the program lasts for a long time and that it's effective for a long time. And so we need to ensure that the implementation obviously involves some adaptation to the setting, right? We talked about that before, but we also need to make sure that it takes place and it lasts a while. So that's the sort of longitudinal effect. And we need to make sure it's sustainable. And one way we do that is making it institutionalized. So we put the practices, the procedures of the innovation of the program in the setting itself, in an institution, in an organization, so that not just one person is in charge of it, so that it's sort of mixed into the culture of an organization or mixed into the culture of a community. So to review, again, the things that we need to think about is, what is a program? What is a prevention program? What does it do? What's the goals of it? How are they disseminated? What are the various models of that? What are the various components of the 3 implementation models? What are some of the factors that affect implementation? And what are the steps to implementing a program?